Hello, students, and welcome to our lectures on Sons and Lovers. So, we will be discussing about D.H. Lawrence's novel Sons and Lovers and its cinematic adaptations. We will be talking about the 1960s cinematic adaptation of Sons and Lovers, and then we will be going through the film adaptation of Sons and Lovers, which was published in 2003. So to start off with the 1960s version, of which I have taken a picture of Paul and Miriam. So if you take the 1960s Sons and Lovers, we see that the timelines do not really fall in line with that of the book, right? So the beginning of the Sons and Lovers 1960s adaptation is beginning with the death of Arthur, right? But this is fictional inaccuracy to a certain extent because not actually to a certain extent, it's complete uh, fictional inaccuracy because Arthur does not die in the book, right? It is Walter Morel who dies in the book, but that is adapted in the 2003 version. But interestingly, it starts with the death of Arthur in the 1960s version. So we had to talk about this in terms of the film director's motive, or also we can talk about it in terms of how that can be interpreted, considering that this is a movie, right? Considering that this is like a movie, a 2-hour movie of a book, which is around, I believe, 400 pages or so, to tell it exactly, 372 pages of the Wordsworth Classics, right? So my Wordsworth Classics Sons and Lovers book has 372 pages. So this is adapted into this 2-hour movie. So therefore, we can talk or interpret the reasons as to why it starts with the death of Arthur. So maybe we can say that or justify that the movie starts with the death of Arthur, which we can interpret as a creative liberty that the filmmaker has taken. Uh, so we can say that Jack Cardiff, the film director, maybe would have wanted to make a strong impact and focus on Paul's choices in his path towards his development. That is, development in terms of his vocation meaning employment, right? Because in the film, after Arthur's death, we see that Paul Morel making a strong assertion or a strong resolution to never become a miner like his father and Arthur, right? And continues to fulfill a more aesthetic path, aesthetic career path, that is as an artist. So here we can say that Cardiff has captured the structure of the story because Lawrence's narrative is actually a Bildungsroman, right? As you know, the Victorian 19th century novel and even Sons and Laws, including Sons and Laws, they follow mostly the Bildungsroman tradition. And this is something we can see in Victorian novels, right? Following the tradition of the Bildungsroman. So I believe for this, we have to identify what a Bildungsroman narrative is first. So to give you an idea, I want to go to presentation slide, Sons and Laws as a Bildungsroman. So what is a Bildungsroman? Bildungsroman emerged during the 19th century, and the Bildungsroman, which is a novel of self-development or apprenticeship novel, are the best English equivalents. They feature a protagonist, an apprentice to life whose goal is to master it so that he can achieve an ideal or ambition, fulfillment of which will heighten his sense of self, and often fictionalizes its author growing up. So in this case, it's Lawrence, who has modeled this book based on his life as well, right? So therefore, it has autobiographical elements. And then Bildungsroman can include the journey through life, which is internalized in terms of the protagonist. And if we talk about the Bildungsroman protagonist, we see that he is passive, reflective, intellectual, and artistic, which are precisely the kind of characteristics we can identify with relation to Paul Morel. And also the choices of the central character who develops from childhood to maturity is based on four principal uh, characteristics which actually make up the Bildungsroman uh, tradition, or which actually captures the Bildungsroman tradition in terms of its central characters development. So that is based on vocation, mating, religion, and identity. And it is with identity we see the self-actualization process of the protagonist, where he comes to a position in life towards the end of the novel, where he has achieved a development, where he has achieved self-actualization. So there is moving forwards, the notion of moving forward, so achieving progress, right? So in terms of this book, we see that it is about the conflict between this alienated individual, which we can identify as Paul, and the cultural forces such as family, neighborhood, class, religion, and ethical milieu, against which the individual seeks to establish himself, right? So in this novel, we see Paul's struggle to free his soul from his mother and become an artist. And he is conflicted as a result due to economic necessities in the book. So in this book, we see Paul's movement towards self-realization expressed symbolically in his rejection of adjustment to everyday. So this adjustment to everyday life is something we can see with his siblings and Annie as well as Arthur, right? They were able to adapt themselves. They were able to adjust themselves to the context which is around them, to their social context, to their social milieu. But Paul is unable to do so, right? And I also said that the Bildungsroman can fictionalize its author growing up. So in this novel too, we have characteristics of the confessional genre of writing, and it is largely autobiographical because Lawrence has modeled it after his own life. So that means that the experiences and adventures of the protagonists are important to Paul's of the protagonists are important, right? So in this novel, we see development in terms of the character, the male protagonist, that is Paul Morel. So therefore, we see, particularly see the psychological development and the self and the sense of self, right? The sense of in the individual, the sense of the individual's identity, his development becomes very important when it comes to the Bildungsroman narrative. So therefore, if we take Cardiff's movie, we see that this structure of the Bildungsroman tradition is actually there to a certain extent. And we can interpret that Arthur's unexpected death. I say unexpected death because it doesn't happen in the narrative. So therefore, if you read the novel and then you watch the movie, it actually shocks you because you do not expect it, right? It is completely unexpected. So therefore, we can interpret Arthur's unexpected death is perhaps used by Jack Cardiff to make an impact in Paul's choice of career in terms of his refusal for adapting to his context, like his siblings Arthur and Annie did. Maybe that was used by the film director to make that impact, to kind of secure and solidify Paul's development in terms of his vocational choices, his refusal to be like his father, his refusal to be like, to adapt himself into the lifestyle of a miner, which was also like the most obvious career choice available to him, considering that His father was also a miner, but you know that Paul is very different. He's artistic, right? He's reflective, contemplative, speculative. And he undergoes a number of challenges in his life in order to achieve that process of self-actualization towards the end of the novel. And if we come back to this 1960s movie, we see that towards the end of the film, it's just actually, to a certain extent, capture the self-actualization process of the Bildungsroman when the protagonist achieves maturity. Because in the movie, in the ending scene, we see Paul with Miriam, right? So if we go to that section, I think that is the last part of the novel. So if I play music too, sorry, share sound.
I'm sure I'll never find anyone as good as you, or any love as good as yours. But I don't want to find it, because I want to be free. I don't ever want to belong to anyone again. Never anymore. And perhaps I'll understand at last what it means to live.
Okay, so you see that towards the ending scene of the 1960s movie, when you come to this scene of Paul and Miriam, Paul bids farewell to Miriam, saying that he wishes to discover himself. He conveys his need for his freedom and his refusal to be smothered, right? Because you know that the mother's obsessive fixation with her son, with the expectations that she has had for her son, Paul did feel smothered, which also eventually led to his failures with fulfilling with achieving fulfilling relationships with the romantic pursuits that he had in his life with Miriam as well as Clara, right? So after the death of his mother, he refuses to be smothered, right? He refuses to be limited and restricted. Therefore, he wants to like completely break away from his bond with Miriam. And therefore, you see that it is perfectly captured in the movie, right? Because it is with this Paul achieves his self-actualization process. And also the film, this is not the exact ending scene of the movie, because you see the film ends with that railway station, right? Him leaving towards the railway station in the movie, with along with the music, right? So that gives a sense that he's going on a journey towards self-discovery. So therefore, we can say that the movie is successful in giving a very strong sense of self-actualization, which is also there in the novel, right? And that is the most important part, or like one of the things which like basically makes up the essence of the narrative. If you do not have Paul's self-actualization process, his growth, his maturity from all the experiences that he has had in his life, uh, it won't be capturing, the movie won't be capturing the essence of the narrative, right? So but though I do say that it does follow the Bildungsroman tradition, the 1960s movie does follow the Bildungsroman tradition to a certain extent. If we take the complete structure of the movie, we see that it is somewhat different, right? Because instead of depicting Paul's development from childhood to maturity, we see that the film actually starts with Paul's childhood. And apart from Arthur's death, we also see some more discrepancies when it comes to Lawrence's narrative and the 1960s movie, such as the picture of Miss Weston, or she's also known as Gypsy, which is given to Paul and his mother in the train station by Walter. and Walt is unable to like pick up the picture, and Paul is unable to give it. So they're both holding the picture in their hands and later on comments on it, right? So in the book, the picture comes through the post, but it is not seen in that way in the film. So again, like maybe for the purposes of making an impact, right? And another thing which we can talk about is this relationship between Paul and Miriam, because I believe that in the 1960s movie, they really portrayed quite beautifully. That is just my personal opinion rather than in the 2003 movie. So one of the very important aspects when it comes to Miriam is the fact that she's a religious person. She's a spiritual person, right? And that is something which Paul himself struggles a lot with, because he does indeed feel a strong spiritual bond and relationship towards and bond, a strong spiritual bond towards Miriam. But at the same time, he is struggling with his need to express his passion towards her carnally, while she is struggling with her inability to cater to his expectations, right? So therefore, this spiritual relationship Miriam expects from Paul is portrayed in the film in a very direct way, right? Because in the very first few scenes, we see Paul's kiss and Miriam's rejection of it, and his accusation that she wants him spiritually, not as a man, but as this disembodied spirit. So that is very directly depicted in the movie, right? And another thing which we had to talk about in the 1960s movie is, is how sexuality is depicted. And we will be talking about sexuality with relation to this theorist called Laura Mulvey later towards the lecture. But for the moment, we will comment directly in relation to the 1960s movie, right? So we see that sexuality is actually beautifully realized by Cardiff, who emphasizes on achieving these facial expressions, particularly the eye contact, to convey intimacy and passion. However, this is something which is absent in the 2003 movie, right? Because you see, passion and intimacy in the 2003 movie are actually conveyed through very explicit sexual encounters. And such sexual explicit encounters are not at all evident in the 1960s movie, right? And also, apart from that, the use of music is also important in the film, right? Because one of the predominant thematic preoccupations in Lawrence's book is the mother's obsessive fixation with her own sons and her jealousy of losing the place of her son's hearts to the lovers in their life. With relation to Walter, it is Gypsy, and with relation to Paul, it is Miriam, and then with Clara, but largely towards Miriam, right? Because she's afraid Miriam wants to possess Paul all to herself. So it is interesting the music that is played, which gives a very foreboding sense in the 1960s movies. So through the music, we see how effectively it has been incorporated by Cardiff, such as in the scenes which indicate the mother's jealousy over Paul spending too much of his time with Miriam, whom she does not approve, right? And if we also talk about authenticity, one of the beautiful aspects in Lawrence's narrative in terms of how authentically he captures Nottinghamshire, the miners' lives and hardships of Nottinghamshire, the Nottinghamshire dialect of the father, right? So that's important because you see throughout the scenes between Gertrude and Walter Morell, the filmmaker has made a conscious effort to capture Walter Morell's Nottinghamshire dialect as opposed to Gertrude Morell's use of standard English. So that discrepancy or that difference between the two dialects of the mother and the father is captured by Cardiff in a very authentic manner, right? Also, when it comes to the lives of the miners, their hardships and suffering have been beautifully adapted into the novel. So maybe another reason why the novel started with Arthur's death, uh, practically, perhaps it is to like avoid screen time because it evidently cannot uh, talk about every aspect or every important detail of Paul's siblings' life when the actual focus is on the main character, Paul Morel. But apart from that, maybe the film director Cardiff wanted to capture the authenticity of the miners' lives, their hardships, how they can lose their lives so easily when it comes to these unexpected accidents which can happen in the mines. So maybe the film director wanted to capture that in an authentic sense as well. So we can perhaps interpret that Arthur's death to a certain extent in the 1960s movie might be as a result of that, right? So from there, now I I want to move on to the 2003 movie. So this is a picture which I have taken from the 2003 movie. And there is also a reason why I have specifically taken that picture, but you will actually see that when we talk about Laura Mulvey's essay with relation to Sansa Lawless, right? So talking about Sansa Lawless 2003 movie, we can say that because of its length, the Sons and Lovers 2003 edition captures a number of scenes of Gertrude, that is Paul's mother's past, how her loss of expectations in marriage with Walter, considering how she unrealistically ennobles Walter's profession beyond his station, eventually leads her into agony and disillusionment, right? We see the shattering of happiness when it comes to the way in which the relationship between Walter and Gertrude is actually adapted in the movie, right? And then the film depicts how Gertrude attempts to find solace and a sense of fulfillment or satisfaction through placing the burden of such expectations on her sons. Because as men, she knows that they have more independence and more social mobility in this patriarchal society. And then, apart from that, the film also depicts how the sons are also burdened as a result, right? Such as in scenes between William and Miss Weston, where he compares his mother to Miss Weston and continues to be frustrated and disillusioned because she is not like Gertrude. And this is something he directly expresses again and again in the movie, right? In the film, as well as in the book, in Lawrence's book as well. And in terms of sexuality, Lawrence's novel has been based to a number of psychoanalytic interpretation. So in 2003 movie, the Oedipus complex, which has been analyzed in the novel by critics, is also evident in the 1960s movie, right? So you see that in this novel has been like largely interpreted in a psychoanalytic sense. So critics do this by particularly referring Sigmund Freud's Oedipus complex about the child's emergent sexuality, right? So you know about the Oedipus complex, the notion that, to explain it very simply, that all male children form an erotic attachment to their mother and become jealous of the mother's relationship with the father, right? And then the male child with that he fears of the idea of being castrated by the father. Of course, this doesn't have to be necessarily direct, they can be metaphorical, right? And this basically leads to him to repress his sexual desire for the mother, and therefore he wants to build his own sexual experiences, right? he avoids at this incestuous kind of desire towards his own mother because of the fear of castration. So if a boy does not successfully fulfill these steps, he will carry the Oedipus complex with them towards adulthood, according to Sigmund Freud. So we can say that the Oedipus complex between Paul complex when it comes to the character Paul Morel, and also when it comes to the character of Walt Morel, is evident even more because they witness this abusive nature of the parents' relationship growing up, right? The mother verbally abuses Walt Morel, and Walt Morel even physically abuses Gertrude Morel. And it is this kind of domestic violence that the children see and like grow up seeing, right? Which we can analyze that might have had a very huge psychological impact as children grew up, right? So therefore, as a result, they learn to hate their father and become very sympathetic towards their mother. They want to protect the mother. Uh, and Gertrude Morel is also overly protective of her children, right? And she shelters them from Walter Morel completely. And even at one point, Walter accuses her of pitting the children against him, right? And this only helps in fueling this dislike, the children's dislike against the father, their hatred towards the father. And one of the important things I believe, which is there both in the book and the movie, is when Paul asks his mother directly not to sleep with Walter, right? So that is like one of the important instances which critics usually refer to when referring to the Oedipus complex in D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers. Okay. So apart from that, another thing which we can talk about in the 2003 movie is the expressiveness of characters, right? So to a certain extent, expressiveness, what I found is, seems to be lacking in the 2003 movie, because you see Miriam seemed to be entirely too indifferent with her facial expressions, rather than trying to emulate the spirituality and seriousness of the character in Lawrence's text. Uh, and very interestingly, like in the 1960s movies, we saw a lot of playfulness and this bond between Paul and Miriam more rather than in the 2003 movie, because there is again like a difference from the book in terms of how Paul and Miriam develop their relationship. They develop their relationship from childhood in Lawrence's text, but that doesn't happen like that in the 2003 movie, right? And also, when it comes to Clara and Paul in the 2003 movie, it also seemed quite lackluster, right? Because they didn't really have the passion which was actually communicated in Lawrence's book, while more passion was actually conveyed between them in the 1960s edition. Uh, because if you remember in the 1960s one, there was this a very memorable scene where Paul and Clara continues to play their card game while the mother continues to make noise and interrupt and remind them of the time again and again, right? So throughout that entire moment, you see passion was actually conveyed in the 1960s movie through the glances, the lingering touches and intimate kisses. While in the 2003 edition, more emphasis seemed to have been like focused on depicting the carnal and sexual acts via the screen, but without the actual passion conveyed through maybe the gestures or the facial expressions between the characters themselves, like the scenes between Clara and Paul, which lack the passion and connection conveyed through their facial expressions and gestures, and how their intimacy is merely reduced to a number of sexual and carnal encounters and scenes of public nudity, which seem to have been given the preference when it comes to the 2003 movie, right? There were like a number of like over the an emphasis towards these very overt sexual encounters in the 2003 movie, right? And apart from that, what the 2003 movie particularly captures is how Paul's failures in his romantic pursuits are largely as a result of him being unable to give himself to his lovers due to his love, attachment, and fixation with his mother. So we see that despite his sexual consummation of the relationship with Clara, it doesn't lead him towards complete fulfillment. And while Miriam appeals to his spiritual and idealistic side, she really cannot cater to the carnal passion which Paul expects of her, right? So the 2003 movie actually captures Paul's trials, tribulations, and failures with all the women in his life, which leads him to the development, maturation, and realization that he does not want to be limited, restricted, and stifled. He doesn't want to be smothered anymore, right? However, the 2003 movie captures Paul's grief over the loss of his mother towards the end, more than focusing on his seeking of his own freedom and identity rather than the 1960s movie, right? So, though it does capture it by showing that Paul is able to move on, the focus is more towards his grief rather than self-actualization. And another thing which we have to talk about is Lauren's depiction and portrayal of women, right? So D.H. Lawrence has been subjected to a number of criticisms for his portrayal of women in terms of how they are depicted as being exploited by Paul for his own development. And we see this to a great extent in the film as well, where he's unable to give himself to either Clara or Miriam, and how his relationships with them leads towards his own realization that he does not want to be involved in a relationship which would lead to a stifling marital union, right? So in that sense, we see the Bildungsroman tradition of the novel in terms of mating has been captured in the film adaptation, right? Because mating as in mating, mating, plays a significant role in the maturation process and the psychological development of the protagonist, right? So despite of the fact that whether it is a male character or a female character, if they are the protagonists, we see that they inevitably use, mostly when it comes to male characters, male protagonists, they inevitably use and exploit several members of the opposite sex. Because as you know, Bildungsroman has a tendency to adopt the protagonist's point of view to maximize the protagonist's point of view for the reader. And this central character's sense of self-concern, which means that the part played by the opposite sex is actually instrumental rather than performing an independent function of its own. So why do I say this? It is because the function of the opposite sex in this novel, especially in terms of Clara and Miriam, is for the sake of the male protagonist, for Paul, right? Because their primary function is to contribute to the growth and development of the protagonist, and not really to be considering the preoccupations and emotions and feelings of the women characters, which might be exploited in the process. So therefore, instead of focusing on these emotions and feelings of Clara and Miriam, who can be exploited in terms of how they cater to Paul's growth and development, what their role in this Roman tradition is to actually to be instrumental in Paul's development rather than performing a functional role of their role. And to a large extent, we see that it is evident, such roles are evident in the cinematic adaptations as well. And of course, another thing about the 2003 movie, there is no Arthur. The character, his Paul's sibling Arthur, is not there. However, that is understood in terms of the time constraints of the movie, right? Because including the other siblings means more time to build up their story, which is hard considering the aspects the movie has chosen to focus on. And also because the movie did choose to focus on Annie and her life to a certain extent as well, right? And another thing that I want to discuss in this lecture is Laura Mulvey. So if you look at your LMS and you go to today's date, you will see that I have uploaded an essay called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema by Laura Mulvey. So this is like a very important essay which we have to study in the classroom. So we won't be like studying this through like if we won't be studying this entire essay, but I actually want you to take some time to read this essay and also apply it to your analysis of the Sons and Lovers 1960s movie and the 2003 movie, because sexuality is a very important theme in this. It's a very important theme in the two movies as well as Lawrence's text. And this is like a great article in which you can discuss how sexuality has been depicted in the film adaptations as well as in the novel, right? Specifically when it comes to the adaptations. So if we take this article, Visual Pleasure and the Narrative Cinema, we see that Laura Mulvey in this essay, she's talking about the elements of voyeurism and fetishistic scopophilia, right? So fetishistic scopophilia is something actually she explains about it and she talks about what it is in the essay. So therefore you can read it to get a detailed idea. But basically what is meant by scopophilia is the sexual pleasure one derives from watching others' nudity or sexual activity in a very voyeuristic sense, right? So Laura Mulvey in this essay talks about the elements of voyeurism and fetishistic scopophilia and also that which basically make up that narcissistic male gaze. So this narcissistic male gaze, or the male gaze, you can call it by itself, is very important when it comes to this essay. It is where Laura Mulvey exbuilds what is meant by the male gaze, which is used as like this pivotal theoretical concept, especially in gendered film analysis. So Laura Mulvey in this essay, she critically comments on the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s Hollywood cinema by focusing on the man or the male protagonist, who is most oftenly a male heterosexual white man, and then also the women who are involved with them, but still don't have the casual agency which men do, but are kind of acted upon. So Mulvey is interested in this tendency, and she's interested in what this tendency does in a world which subjugates women and is privileged because the world is patriarchal, right? And I just want to read up two sections of this essay and go to an analysis of them. with relation to sons and lovers. So the first part I want to read is actually in the section Women as Image, Man as the Bearer of the Look. I believe this section is in page number 10 of the article. So let's go to that section first. Okay, here. This is the section, Women as Image, Men as Bearer of the Look. We will read this a bit. Women as image, men as bearer of the look. In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly in their traditional exhibitionist role. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact, so that they can be said to connote to be looked atness. Women displayed as sexual object is the leitmotif of erotic spectacle, from pin-up to striptease, from Ziegfeld to Busby Berkeley. She holds the look, plays to, and signifies male desire. Mainstream film neatly combines spectacle and narrative. Note, however, how the musical song and dance numbers break the flow of the diegesis. The presence of woman is an indispensable element of spectacle in normal narrative film. Yet her visual presence tends to work against the development of the storyline, to freeze the flow of action in moments of erotic contemplation. The alien presence then has to be integrated into cohesion with the narrative. So here, Laura Mulvey, she's talking about a very important gendered aspect of film studies. And as I mentioned earlier, it is about the male gaze, right? M-A-L-E space G-A-Z-E, male gaze. So Mulvey says that in classical Hollywood films, men look at women, but women don't look back at them with the same level of power or with the same level of connotation, objectification, which men do. In a sense, it's like voyeurism, that idea of looking without getting a look back. And that is emblematic of the lack of balance in the power structure, which establishes the passive woman and the active male character, according to Mulvey. So Mulvey actually says that the male gaze is baked into the way in which narrative works in films. And she says that this holds or temporarily stops. It holds narrative progress in the film. So as examples, Mulvey says something like in classical Hollywood films, they would often have these moments when the narrative is suspended so that we can appreciate the spectacle of a woman performing. And in many ways, this is actually literal. And there are many other examples of classical Hollywood movies in which the narrative flow will halt or will temporarily stop so that we'll have a moment where, say, maybe a female characters or a female character will perform on stage and our male protagonist simply looks, and then the characters and then, like, as the male protagonists look, the camera lens actually follows the spectator. right? So basically, I think that was not very clear. Basically, in a movie, for example, if we have a female character performing, if she's dancing or singing, everyone will be looking at her, right? So just like everyone, the male protagonist particularly will be looking at her. So the camera lens will actually follow the gaze of the male protagonist, and the spectator, us, we will be allowed to look through this gaze of the male protagonist, which is followed by the lens of the camera, and allow the kind of flow of narrative progress to suspend for a little while the male protagonist is basically ogling the woman, right? And to give you a better idea of this, I will show you like a very few clips of classic Hollywood movies which Mulvey is showing in her text. So I will show you this video. You can also follow the link and watch the entire thing by yourself, but we won't be going through the entire one. To give you basically an idea. There is no music in this clip, right? So there won't be any music in this, okay? Okay. So as you can see, like you see the camera lens is basically following the figure of the woman. So when the camera lens is following the figure of the woman, that is shown as the protagonist's male gaze, right? As you can see in this clip. So the spectator, us, we are also following the protagonist's male gaze, right? That is what I'm trying to explain here. This is what Mulvey is trying to explain here when the woman is forced to play this passive role while she is shown in the gaze, in through the male gaze of the protagonist, of the male protagonist. And we are made to be the spectator who looks at the film, who looks at the woman through the gaze of the male spectator, right? So that is what Mulvey is trying to explain here. And I said that we will be interpreting what Mulvey is saying here with relation to Sons and Lovers movie adaptations, right? So let's first of all try to detect this, try to see this in the Sons and Lovers 1960s movie adaptation. So I think it's, I will show you the section. Okay, here. Okay, so up until now, like I'm commenting on the 1960s movie. So up until this scene in the 1960s movie, we see Clara working as a women's rights activist and also completely clothed, right? That is how we see Clara in the movie up until this particular scene. And we don't see her particularly or directly subjected to the sensual male gaze via the camera. But here, suddenly, it becomes different, right? So instead of the completely fully clothed strong Clara, we see a more passive, we see a more sensual Clara, right? So we see a very domestic setting, a house and Clara by the fire. And we see Clara in Paul's gaze. And as the spectator, we follow Clara just like Paul's male gaze, through Paul's male gaze, as he comes down the stairs, mesmerized by the sensual picture that Clara makes, right? So that is an important scene in the movie. That is how you can connect it to what Mulvey is saying. And let's also look at two scenes in the 2003 movie and also talk about it. Okay, so I think it starts with, yes. Okay, we'll play it here where Miss Weston is running behind and Paul and Walter is like playing their game, their race, right?
Who won?
I slipped.
My champion.
We should get back.
Okay, so here like we saw two scenes, right? In the first scene, we saw Miss Western, who is subjected to the male gaze through the fascination of Paul. Paul is evidently fascinated by Miss Weston, and also it is through that fascinated gaze, male gaze of Paul, that we see Miss Weston. And then we also see, like, in the same scene, Miss Weston is also subjected to the jealousy of Walter's gaze, right? So it is through these two male gazes that we see Miss Weston projected as this in a very objectified manner, right? And then in the immediate next scene, which is also important, we see Paul's almost voyeuristic gaze through which we follow the camera lens as the spectator stares at Miriam. Miriam, who is unaware about Paul's glance, which is aesthetically appreciating her feminine image that she projects on the screen while enjoying a peaceful moment by herself, right? So those are two aspects which I wanted to talk about in relation to this, in relation to the movie adaptations. And there is also just one section I want to read in page number 12. So we'll go to that as well. Okay, so in this page, here, Mulvey says, man is reluctant to gaze at his exhibitionist-like. Hence the split between spectacle and narrative supports the man's role as the active one of forwarding the story, making things happen. The man controls the film fantasy and also emerges as the representative of power in a further sense, as the bearer of the look of the spectator, transferring it behind the screen to neutralize the extra diegetic tendencies represented by women as spectacle. This is made possible through the process set in motion by structuring the film around a main controlling figure with whom the spectator can identify. As the spectator identifies with the main male protagonist, he projects his look onto that of his life, his screen surrogate, so that the power of the male protagonist as he controls events coincides with the active power of the erotic look, from giving a satisfying sense of omnipotence, right? Okay, so it is very crucial that we have a story that is organized around a male perspective. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the whole system of narration where the woman looks at and she where we otherwise we wouldn't have this whole system of narration which Mulvey looks at and also theorizes this by connecting this identification with the male figure on screen, right? So Laura Mulvey in her essay does this with reference to Jacques Lacan. And here she is referring to Jacques Lacan's notion of the mirror stage, which was a very popular theory and even a popular theory now in terms of how people come to identify themselves as subject, and by subject as in a person with a sense of self-awareness and agency, right? So that is the mirror stage according to the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. So basically, according to Lacan, a mirror stage is when the child recognizes himself or herself in the mirror as an image and recognizes that the mirror image is almost superior to them. It's the idea of having a complete sense of yourself as being almost false because the mirror, as you know, is not equivalent to who we are, right? It is a picture, and it is in some sense an abstraction that resembles us, but it's still not the same thing as Mulvey connects this to looking at the screen, right? So this is a kind of metaphorical connection which Mulvey is doing. But Mulvey says something very important here. She says there's an analogy between the classical Hollywood spectators looking up and seeing often a white male heterosexual protagonist, and then identifying with that person, and then identifying with their hopes and dreams and desires and pursuits of particular goals. So this is even evident with relation to Paul Morrell, both in the 1960s and the 2003 movies, right? Because the story, as you know, is completely in the male protagonist, that is Paul Morrell's perspective. It is aligned with his goals. It is aligned with his desires, his sexual discoveries, his romantic pursuits, and all of that, rather than focusing on the female characters, rather than focusing on the performativity of the female characters, because you know, like in both movies, it follows a very Bildungsroman tradition where the women characters are actually playing instrumental roles in the protagonist's development towards maturity and thereby his self-actualization, rather than playing performative roles by their own, right? And that is the place I want to stop this lecture on Lawrence's Sons and Lovers. So I know I said I will show some of your videos, some of the presentations that you have sent me, but I will use them to grade you instead of playing it through the video. So because I did this lecture today, you can actually take 2 more days to submit your writing project. So if you have anything you are not clear about, anything you want me to explain again, please mail me. And as you know, you won't have an exam for this course. Your writing project is the most important project because it will be allocated 60 marks. So therefore, please upload on the day of the deadline on 27. You need these marks, right? Don't be late to submit and lose marks, right? Okay, so I will stop the lecture here. So this is also the end of all our lectures allocated for this course. Thank you very much for listening.